Thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Hello, I'm Stephen Willis, along with Brian Smith, the Florida football scout. And I do want to let you know that LinkedIn is the college recruiting sponsor across the Locked On Network. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. Brian, we have made it. Let's see. Ole Miss is 6-1. They're doing quite well, but we're getting close to that National Signing Day. And one thing that we're going to be interested in, Ole Miss has one of the best defensive line classes in the country right now, in my opinion. And they might add to it. I think his name's Tony Alfano, the guy at Lackawanna who transferred from Alabama. There's a chance he could be added into this class. This defensive line class, there's some dudes.
Well, we know about Franklin. We've talked about Eccles. Jeffrey Rush, Southern Mississippi kid, doesn't get enough respect, although he's ranked pretty high, but nobody really talks about him in many circles because he committed so long ago. He committed back in March to Ole Miss. And then there's Maurice Davis from the state of Georgia. He's at a program I'm familiar with. I saw him play a couple years ago. Very long and athletic kid. They've got some dudes, and I don't think people really think Ole Miss and think defense because Lane is there. But now that they're getting some of these defensive pieces up front, it changes what you can do long term. And it's not like Lane Kiffin's not going to be a good play caller in a couple of years either.
Yeah, you have a situation to where most of the defensive line for the future for Ole Miss is basically stacked in this class. You have a defense that at one point will have Kamarion Franklin, Suntarian Perkins, Cam Beavers, Jeffrey Rush, William Eccles, all of those on the field at the same time. If you're looking at like the sophomore years of Franklin and Eccles and those guys.
That's right.
And when that happens, this defense has a chance to be really good. And that's a weird thing for a Lane Kiffin coach team.
Now the question is, how well do they gel together and all that stuff, which obviously takes its course over time. But as the saying goes, I'd rather have the talent and figure it out later. So we'll see what they get. But, yeah, Ole Miss is in a totally different spot with this recruiting class than they've been in a long, long time.
So I'm making his name wrong. If I do, I apologize. I think his name's Antonio Alfano. He signed with Alabama out of high school, had a problem with like seizures, I think it was. He ended up dropping some weight. He ended up transferring out to Colorado and then Lackawanna. The seizure thing is apparently under control now. He's put the weight back on that got him the Alabama scholarship to start with. What do you know about this kid?
I remember seeing him out of high school, and he was just a kid that everybody should have recruited. He had the ability with the length. He had some length on his arms. He could get off on that first step. And he was a young man that, again, like if Alabama recruits you, there's a reason, especially with defensive line. They don't really recruit D-line. They pick more than they do anything else. So for him to be scouted by them and they go after him like they did tells you a lot. But it is unfortunate the seizure thing happened. But, hey, I'm glad he's back on track.
Yeah, and Pete Golding was the defensive coordinator that recruited him to Alabama. So there's probably some familiarity there as well. So Ole Miss in the high school class, they have, I don't know, somewhere around 20 commitments at this moment. And there's no 25 anymore, by the way. 3 years ago, if you signed 20 or got 20 high school players, you'd only have spots for 5 transfer portal players, and that doesn't exist anymore. So with those 20 players, how ready do you think Ole Miss is switching over to transfer portal more so than high school recruiting? It's kind of like just maintain. Now let's start looking to fill in pieces.
Unless it's a higher end high school kid, let's be honest, Ole Miss, what do you think? Top 5 in the nation over the last couple of years of putting portal players in and actually getting production. They've hit high enough. I would think they'd be pretty selective from this point through signing day on adding any pieces. But again, if you can get a 4-star kid to flip, whatever, that's fine. But otherwise, yeah, I think it's portal. And I think it'll also still be defensive minded because Lord only knows Kiffin finds the offensive pieces and puts them in play.
Yeah, and he can handle that like I have not seen very often. It's really impressive. We always joke about him being a savant and stuff, offense and all this. And it's really true with Lane, because he does something once or twice a game and that you're like, I didn't think about doing that. And now that I see it, yes, that was absolutely the perfect thing to do.
His play calling is really good. I know there's one former DC in the SEC that thought that he was the best play caller in the league a few years ago. If you're even in that conversation, it puts things in perspective, but he flat out said he was the best. So I thought that was interesting.
Well, tonight Ole Miss plays Vanderbilt, and now this, I say this is a legacy game, or not a legacy game for Jackson Dart. This is a program game for Ole Miss, but it's not about beating Vanderbilt. Okay. You have to beat Vanderbilt for the Georgia game and the Texas A&M game to mean something.
Yes.
And to be in that stage puts this Vanderbilt game as a must win, as a program defining game. What say you?
Well, I'm curious. You know how sometimes kids just completely look past opponents. Mm-hmm. College kids are really good at screwing that up. I'd be curious to be a fly on the wall this week from Monday on with meetings, how much they paid attention, because it's still an SEC opponent. And I know Vandy's nowhere near any of the other teams they're going to play down the stretch, but can they put them away early so the starters don't have to get wore out in the fourth quarter? They're hanging out with Lane on the sidelines, not to win, but are they going to dominate? There's a big difference. You need to rest as much as you can with the opponents they have coming up.
Yeah, it really is the next step for Ole Miss football is they need to start acting like a top 10 team. They're winning enough to get into that conversation. They need to start acting like it on the field. So the game against Auburn should have been 42-14 as opposed to 28-21.
100%.
Stuff like that. I think that is the next step for the program.
Yeah, when you get a lead, there's something about gamesmanship and play calling and just finishing plays. I mean, they were up 28-14 against Auburn, and you thought, okay, one more play here, and it's over. And,
well, at 28-14 with that Auburn offense, it was over. But I get what you're saying.
Yeah, but I mean, like you could have, you need to you need a scoop and score, a sack, something like that. And Auburn gets this. It's just like, wow, you at least gave them hope. You can't do that because you do that against a better opponent, you lose. So you're right. They have to take that next step, and Vandy's a good way to do it, because if you can't do it against Vandy, it's not going to go well against Georgia.
Yeah, because at this point, I think Ole Miss is building towards Georgia. In an ideal world, you would get through Vanderbilt. Now, I'm just get through Vanderbilt because everybody and their mother is looking ahead to Texas A&M next week. Then Texas A&M, I think Ole Miss needs to show up against A&M, like
100%.
Really show up, and then get ready for that.
Physical, so they're better.
And I think Ole Miss's game plan will be similar to what they did against LSU, because Lane, for all he does, they respect LSU's front seven because LSU's earned that reputation. Sure. And so they try to protect the offensive line. So all of a sudden the ball's getting out at different tempos, at different spots on the field. It's moving around in different directions. All of a sudden those linebackers and DBs had no idea what was going on. They couldn't win. And that offense got going, and they just essentially in the fourth quarter, Ole Miss got the ball with 2 minutes to go in the game on their own 12-yard line. And the only question was, how much time is going to LSU going to have after Ole Miss scored a touchdown?
That was it. LSU looked lost.
Yeah.
Especially in that fourth quarter. They just kind of lost any gumption they had because they were confused.
Yeah, I think the game plan will be similar to that, because A&M's front seven's pretty good, and their secondary – Their secondary got victimized by Jalen Milroe, and
he's not Jackson Dart.
Yeah, so it should be interesting. Anyway, thank you for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Brian, thank you so much for joining us. We'll catch you next week, buddy.
All right, I appreciate it. Thank you much.